The story of power is never simple. Behind every crown, every victory, and every title of glory lies a truth that is darker, sharper, and far more cruel than the world is willing to remember. History records emperors, kings, and even gods walking among men. But rarely does it tell us how those same gods were reduced to nothing. How men who ruled with fire in their veins and thunder in their names died in chains, forgotten, despised, or enslaved. This is the story of one such man, a man who rose higher than most could dream, who was hailed as a god in his lifetime, and yet who met his end not in marble halls or golden palaces, but in bondage. He became a god, but died a slave. In the ancient world, divinity was not only prayed to, it was worn like armor. Rulers claimed to be chosen by the heavens. Some even claimed to be gods themselves. For subjects who lived in fear, this made them untouchable, greater than mortal men. To question them was to question the will of the divine. And so, armies bowed, cities surrendered, and nations collapsed beneath the weight of their names. But what happens when a god is stripped bare? What happens when the crown slips, when the statues are torn down, and when the very people who once worshipped now spit upon the memory of their idol? This is the fall that history tried to bury in silence, the fall of a man who was too loved, too hated, and too human to escape his fate. He was not born a god. He was born a man, fragile, young, and hungry for the world. His family was not destined for greatness, his bloodline not the purest, but fate has a way of bending toward those bold enough to seize it. In the chaos of shifting empires, wars, and rivalries, he rose. Through charisma, through cunning, and through a spark that set him apart, he drew others to him. And in an age where belief was as strong as swords, belief was all he needed. People whispered his name. They painted it on walls. They told their children of his victories. Priests stepped forward and declared him divine. And whether he believed it or not, he accepted the role. He became a god, not by birth, but by choice, and by the desperate need of those who wanted to believe that someone greater than them walked upon the earth. His empire stretched far and wide. His word became law. His face was carved into marble, stamped into coin, etched into the memory of his people. He commanded armies, not just with orders, but with the certainty that the heavens themselves marched behind him. And as victories mounted, the line between man and God blurred. His people cheered his name as though it were a prayer. His enemies cursed it as though it were a storm. But with every rise comes the shadow of a fall. Power is never free, and divinity, once worn like a crown, becomes a burden heavier than chains. Whispers began. They always do. That he was no god, but a man. That his victories were not divine, but fragile. That his greatness was not eternal, but temporary. The same voices that had lifted him began to turn, slowly, quietly, like a tide rolling back into the sea. And when tides turn, even gods cannot stop the flood. His enemies gathered in secret. Those who once bowed began to plot, and the cracks in his divinity widened. He was betrayed not by strangers, but by those closest to him. The ones who had shared his tables, his counsels, his triumphs. They did not strike with swords at first. They struck with silence. They withdrew their loyalty, withheld their praise, and began to speak of him not as a god, but as a man, flawed, arrogant, and dangerous. And so the god was brought down, not in a blaze of glory, not upon the battlefield, but in chains. Imagine the sight. The man once worshipped, dragged through streets as a prisoner. The crowd, once roaring with chants of devotion, now mocking, spitting, laughing. The statues broken, the coins defaced. His name spoken only as a curse. He was not a god now. He was less than a man. He was a slave. This is the cruelty of history, that the same voices that raise you to the heavens will, in the same breath, cast you into the dust. He who had been called divine now carried shackles. He who had been adored now lived in fear. He who had ruled an empire now lived and died in bondage. He became a god, but died a slave. This is where our story begins. With the rise of a man above his own limits, with the worship of thousands who saw the divine in him, and with the fire of betrayal that burned away everything he once was. To understand his fall, we must first walk through the steps of his rise, from dust to godhood to ashes. He was born into a world that had no place for him. His family name was unremarkable, his childhood ordinary, and his destiny no greater than that of 1,000 other men. Yet fate is not written only in bloodlines. Fate bends for those bold enough to seize it. The boy grew into a man with a fire in his eyes, the kind that drew attention even in crowded streets. He was not just handsome, he was magnetic. His voice carried weight, his presence filled a room, and his words planted themselves in hearts like seeds. Soldiers listened to him. Priests nodded when he spoke. Commoners whispered of him long before he ever commanded armies. At first, his victories were small. A border skirmish, a city won, a rival humbled. But each triumph carried stories, and stories travel faster than swords. Soon, the people began to believe he was more than a man. For how else could he rise so quickly? How else could he defeat enemies stronger, older, and richer than him? It was the priests who gave him the first crown of divinity. They claimed the gods themselves had chosen him. His victories were not the work of strategy, they said, but of the heavens. His survival in battles where others fell was proof of protect. Tion. His words, they insisted, were not his own, but carried the breath of eternity. And the people believed. Temples began to echo with his name. Statues rose, not only of gods of old, but of him, standing beside them. His image appeared on coins, a face not mortal but divine. He was no longer just a ruler. He was an incarnation of power itself. For the common man, it was easier to worship than to question. A god walking among them was a comfort, a shield, a promise that their empire was blessed. For the nobles and generals, his divinity was both a shield and a threat. They bowed in public, but in their hearts, they feared. For what man could oppose one who claimed to be a god? The emperor leaned into this belief. He spoke of destiny. He declared himself chosen. He surrounded himself with gold, marble, and rituals meant to blur the line between heaven and earth. He wore robes stitched with stars, crowns shaped like the sun. He rode through cities not as a man of flesh, but as a vision, untouchable, unshakable, eternal. Crowds gathered by the thousands just to glimpse him. Mothers lifted children high, shouting his name like a prayer. Soldiers marched with renewed fervor, believing no battle could be lost while their god-emperor watched. Even his silence carried weight. The pause before his words was as sacred as scripture. He became a god not by birth, not by right, but by belief. And belief, when shared by millions, becomes stronger than any army. But divinity is a dangerous crown. For every man who bowed in worship, there was another who whispered in doubt. The Senate, once the heart of power, found itself ignored. Generals who had spent decades in war were replaced by a young man's whispers. And courtiers, hungry for influence, saw themselves shut out by a single figure who grew closer to the emperor than any of them could ever hope. The emperor's godhood, once his greatest strength, began to breed jealousy and fear. If he was untouchable, what use were they? If his word was divine, what was left of their power? And so the seeds of betrayal were planted, quietly, patiently. But in those years of rising glory, the emperor could not see it. His eyes were fixed only on the man beside him, the one who had captured not only his heart but his trust. For even gods, it seems, are not free from love. In marble palaces under candlelight, he was no god. He was a man who laughed, who whispered, who found comfort in arms not bound by politics. To the world, he was eternal. To one man, he was simply human. And that was both his greatest strength and his fatal weakness. This was the height of his reign. Statues rose, temples echoed his name, armies marched under his command, and the world seemed unshakable. But it is always at the peak of a mountain that the fall begins. For divinity, once questioned, becomes a weapon, and the same fire that lit his throne would one day devour it. The higher a man rises, the more enemies gather in his shadow. For years, the emperor believed himself untouchable. His statues glowed under the sun, his temples thundered with chants, and his armies painted the world with his name. But behind marble pillars, behind golden curtains, the whispers grew louder. "They call him a god," one senator muttered, "but he bleeds as a man." "He is no divine ruler," a general sneered. "He is a distraction, drunk with love and blinded by desire." And in taverns, in market stalls, the common people whispered too. "If he is a god, why does Rome grow weaker? Why does famine spread while he feasts in his palace?" Faith is the strongest weapon, but once it cracks, it shatters like glass. The trap was not sudden, it was patient. First, the Senate stripped his influence piece by piece. They questioned his decrees, delayed his orders, and painted him as careless. The generals, once loyal, began to turn their soldiers' hearts against. As a slave, the same man who had walked marble halls now scrubbed floors. The same hands that had signed decrees of nations now carried burdens for strangers. His voice, once cheered by thousands, now begged for mercy in silence. The humiliation was complete. He became what Rome wanted him to be, proof that no man, no matter how high, could escape its grip. His death would not be glorious. It would not be in battle, nor in ceremony. It would be slow, quiet, and cruel. The death of a forgotten slave. In the empire's records, his name was erased. He was written off as a tyrant, a liar, a fool. But the people remembered, for memory cannot be burned. In whispers, in stories, in the hearts of those who had once worshipped him, the tale lived on. The man who was a god, but who died a slave. The end of gods is never loud. It does not come with thunder in the sky or statues collapsing all at once. It comes in silence, the silence of chains, of shadows, of forgotten prayers. The man who had once been emperor, once worshipped as divine, now woke each day not to the sound of trumpets, but to the bark of masters. His bed was straw, his robe a rag. Where once courtiers bowed, now strangers spat. The marble halls of Rome had been replaced by dirt floors, the scent of incense by the stench of sweat and ash. He was no longer a man. He was property. Time did what swords and betrayal could not. It wore him down. His back bent beneath burdens. His hands, once lifted in command, cracked with labor. His voice grew hoarse, not from speeches, but from silence. Yet within him, fragments of memory burned. The golden throne, the cheers of the crowd, the warmth of the lover he had once held in secret. Memories that refused to die, even as his body withered. But memories cannot feed a man. They cannot protect him from the lash, from hunger, from the indifference of those who saw him only as a no.